Chapter 2. Understanding. Radio made herself inhale a breath and exhale it one more time as they entered the dark room. Recorder had introduced it as the surveillance room, which brought Radio no additional comfort. The monitors, screens, images, control panels, buttons, and knobs were overwhelming. Everything Radio never really liked in media was all compacted into a small room. She couldn't believe how much she was running into everything she found so distasteful. The room was barely lit, with the exception of the bright screens that lined the walls, and it made her sight blur. She was surprised to see that tape and recorder led them to the back of the room with a group of 2 other felines.
Why are there so many cats?
Radio knew that her aunt, the studio star, had supported the growth of the domesticated feline species by building her city to the south, but she still found the population of cats surprising, especially after seeing the diverse accommodations of the castle. Studio had made a city exclusively for felines many seasons ago, offering education and shelter, which none of the other species had available freely, making it easier for others to find companions and live in a safe environment away from the harsh elements of media. The population of felines had boomed since, but not so much that Radio thought an entire division would be filled with cat staff in media's capital, where all species were accepted. She almost laughed when a golden-winged bird fluttered into the room and perched on one of the staff's heads. Radio quickly thought it was best to stifle the giggle, as she realized she might witness a bird being eaten right in front of her and her new companions.
Oh, Censor! You're back!
Recorder came up to the tomcat where the bird perched. It was only a moment before Radio realized the tabby was speaking to the bird and not the cat, as she continued.
Was the flight outside fine? Do you think we can send them out?
The bird nodded, and Recorder purred, touching her nose to the bird's beak. She turned to look back at Radio, Video, and Pictures, who all stared at her with surprise.
This is Censor. He'll be detecting the weather outside and warning you of any danger. He's never been able to speak cat, but he understands it well. We've learned a lot of his tongue, too, to make it fair.
Recorder grinned as Pictures chuckled. Radio was even more surprised, as Video only nodded. It's a pleasure to meet him, Pictures chirped. Recorder brightened, turning back to the 2 other cats sitting at the computers. She stared at them both, and then tapped the dark brown Tom's shoulder, startling him. He yelped out loud with his earbuds still in, as he seemed to not have noticed her presence, and stared up at her with round blue eyes. Recorder huffed and turned back to Radio, Video, and Pictures.
This is Widget, our youngest recruit. He'll be helping us to keep you safe and be an extra pair of eyes to look out for any danger.
It's a pleasure to meet you all. Mr. Radio.
His piercing wide blue eyes locked onto Radio's. Radio frowned, surprised how much the boy looked like a kitten version of her father. The small cat chuckled nervously, immediately looking to Radio and Pictures instead.
It's such an honor to meet you all. I'm so glad you come here to meet us. It's really surprising. We don't get many visitors.
He took off the earbuds as he laughed again, even more anxiously. Radio tilted her head as he waved his paw at Censor for the bird to fly away, and then hopped down from his seat. You too, Widget. Pictures arched his brow and smiled at the smaller Tom, while Radio continued looking at the younger Tom curiously. He certainly didn't act like her father, making her push away the thoughts of resemblance. However, he had been the only one to call out her name. There were so many felines nowadays. Patterns and pelt colors were bound to repeat themselves. She could barely remember their names, having met so many animals and cats in one day, but figured the Tom did so because she was the only noble. She lifted up her chin and smiled in support of Picture's assurance to the young cat's apprehension.
Agreed. We want to know everything we can about this, sir.
Widget nodded, and Radio smiled when he sighed a bit in relief and spoke.
I'm sure Cassette will be able to tell you all about the information we've gathered. She knows more about this whole situation from film than the rest of us do, at least. I wish I could listen in and offer more, but I'm afraid I have to take my break.
He backed up, bumping into the seat behind him, which startled him again. He turned for the door after apologizing quietly.
Bye!
He called as he fled from the room. Video glared at the door through which the young Tom left with rebuke in her eyes, and flexed her claws as though she contemplated chasing after him. Radio barely noticed, still staring at where the young Tom had been sitting before.
Strange.
Radio blinked, realizing Widget had mentioned another individual named Film. Her eyes narrowed the slightest at that. She knew Film, as the surveillance director had dated her sister until recently. They had broken off their courtship only a few days before. Actually, she blinked away her thoughts as Recorder spoke, assuring them.
He is always nervous around nobles.
The tan feline rolled her eyes, smiling as she hopped up on the stool that Tom had vacated and started straightening up Widget's desk.
The frequency star used to stop in quite a bit.
After pushing the Tom's earbuds away with her paw, she gestured for Radio and her two companions to come forward to the surveillance wall with her short, thick tail, smiling as they did so.
So, this room is where we'll be tracking you and where you'll be going. It is also where we'll give you updates as the signals to your objective become apparent or alternate. We're still not sure what this mage planned when it did all of this, nor what tricks could be hiding up its sleeves. Sleeves?
Radio frowned, and Recorder pressed a knob that brought an image on screen. It was a video of the mage the files described, dressed in a jester outfit with a blue mist surrounding it. Its eyes gleamed the same cyan blue the cube emitted. It was the beautiful hue which caused Radio's fur to rise, seeing it associated with such a power play against and to incite fear within all of social media. What was even more terrifying to Radio, though, was the large grin spread across the primate's face, showing each and every one of its glittering sharp teeth. Those hadn't been described in the files.
This is the creature that did this.
Recorder pressed a toggle showing the 3 different recordings of the mage.
Our surveillance was taken by the guards and monitors trying to stop it. Explosions of red and cyan fog seem to appear most often with the strange jester, but there's more to it than that.
In one of the images, the blurry capture looked to Radio as though it was a red glowing crystal heart.
This is your objective.
Recorder's voice grew grim as she zoomed in on the object, making Radio's eyes round at the beautiful detail of light and dark threads flickering within it. Tape nodded and continued for Recorder, his tone just as serious.
This was the object created immediately after the king's disappearance. The jester shattered the object, and in some unknown and strange way, some power from its power was released, scattering the broken fragments out to far beyond the castle. From the reaction based on the recordings, it seems this release of power was against the mage's wishes and intent. After the magical creature fled, a message was discovered during the cleanup. It was written in the cat dialect, which was part of the factor in deciding to contact you 3.
Pictures rolled his eyes and sighed, looking to Video. The great feline did not respond in similar fashion, and instead looked intrigued and instantly more focused. Radio, however, was the one to pipe up.
The monkey mage wrote in cat?
She asked incredulously. Recorder looked back down at the 3 answering.
We would assume so, although there was no evidence it had been the mage who wrote it from our recordings. The explosion of magic which occurred as the guards entered kept us from getting a good perspective and full account of the events, for both the crystal object shattering, as well as the origin of the final message left for us.
The tan tabby frowned, turning off the screen. The calico from the back of the room then spoke, the second cat who had been inside the room when they entered. She faced Radio directly, making the smaller feline look over at the patched and striped worker with wide eyes as she lifted up her chin.
We didn't find that so unlikely, though. To escape, it shapeshifted into an avian form, which wouldn't put it beyond writing in cat. The message was clear to state it wanted the youngest titled noble, courier, and monitor to fix this, and we immediately sent out the notice to find you three. When going through the files, the frequency star was the only one to turn up in our database. We weren't aware of you as your parents' second daughter, Miss Radio.
The tricolored feline narrowed her eyes.
The error seemed strange, but has now been corrected. It worked well your sister had been too busy to accept our summons, as she wasn't notified the request was for the youngest feline noble of media.
Radio blinked, frowning.
Oh, that is strange.
She looked over at pictures, wondering if he had any knowledge about the error in the system. Monitors also scanned through reports and files on the followers of media, making her assume he knew something. But he only shrugged, looking as confused as she did before he then added, "That isn't surprising with a bit of introspective analysis. I wasn't aware the Resolution Star had a second kit until I received the report this morning either." That disturbed Radio even more. Why wasn't she in the files? She was already sheltered enough as it was. Her parents never let her venture out by herself, even after she received her title as the Radio Star, while her older sister was allowed to do so. However, the idea of completely being left out as their child...
How did you get my report if I wasn't listed as the daughter of my parents? Even if I wasn't listed as theirs, how was I still not verified as the youngest noble?
She asked, realizing that Pictures was still able to read a report on her digitally.
Upon my supervisor searching your name, having known you, Miss Radio.
The calico arched her brow at Radio. The feline's feathery ears grew hot, knowing the calico was referring to film. The tricolored cat then continued.
He found your name in the Council's database, but it had not been transferred for viewing access to other monitors outside of the capital. We had no trouble adding you, though, dear. Everything is fine now.
The older feline dipped her head. Radio frowned, looking at Video to see what she thought of all of this. But the large tabby looked back down at Radio without offering any expression or opinion on the matter.
I didn't even think he noticed me. I'd greatly appreciate if you thanked him for that, ma'am.
Radio decided to share. She tried to see what Tape was doing as he brought over a case of technological chips. Sensor was now perched on Tape's head, making Radio struggle not to smile.
Of course.
The calico's eyes then softened.
My name is Cassette. It'll be a pleasure working with you and keeping an eye out for the three of you.
She looked over at the stocky Tom and Bird and gestured out her paw.
Tape and Sensor will embed these chips into your ears so we can contact you and track your locations. This will allow us to see the amount of time in which you complete this mission, and talk to you if need be. Our technology has been able to detect the radiating magic from the red shard fragments scattered by studying the fragment already found outside the capital walls. We're trying to develop the technology to detect all forms of magic. But so far, every imprint of temperature and frequency we take of a citizen or artifact has been different, and we have to redevelop the technique for each individual mage we've come across. The detector has come up with multiple signals, which suggests the shard source all to one imprint, which we imagine belongs to the aura of our king.
Radio looked around at the others, trying to gauge their reaction to Cassette's casually spoken words. The king had an imprint of magic. No one else seemed to show any surprise, or, as she originally feared, condemnation of learning the king had a trace of the forbidden practice. She was careful to mask her emotions, nonchalantly nodding as though she were comprehending Cassette's statement as being nothing out of the ordinary. As Sensor began attaching the computer chip and an earpiece to her inner ear with his tiny beak and precise talons. Radio tried not to let her ears flick as he did so, and then spoke more confidently and assuredly than she actually felt.
Well, it'll be a start, and much better than going out looking for shards without any leads. You do incredible work here.
The two siblings beamed.
Thank you, Miss Radio. We're honored to hear that from one of your stature.
Recorder hopped down, smiling as Video crouched for Tape to be able to reach her ear.
We'll take you as far as the Capitol walls to show you the first shard so you can start your journey. We were very lucky that one of them landed close. We may not have been able to invent the device without it.
We should take you there immediately so you can get started on your journey.
Tape clicked the chip and earpiece to Picture's nicked ear, and then quickly looked away when Pictures winced and glared at him. Radio gave Pictures a censoring look for his attitude, but Tape backed up, and then grabbed a large buckle with the bag attached on one side. Recorder hurried over. The two strapped it around Video as the giant tabby rose to her feet.
You'll be able to carry the shards in this, and it should keep them safe from any weather or any trouble you may come across.
Recorder smiled up at Video, who nodded at the tan cat's words. Radio looked concerned at the idea of trouble, but neither Pictures or Video seemed surprised as Recorder and Tape led them out of the surveillance room. Radio instead focused on the feeling of Cassette's piercing green eyes staring into the back of her head. The stare made Radio hope Film hadn't said too much about her. He had never spoken to her when he visited Frequency, and the idea he mentioned her at all made her worry, even if it was probably just protocol. She couldn't shake away her bristled fur upon feeling the older cat's gaze on her way out of the room. Tape and Recorder led the three outside of the Capitol. The two surprised Radio by taking her and the other chosen felines off the road and onto the grass path alongside the city walls. Radio hadn't put her paws on anything but manufactured flooring besides the courtyard beside her house, where the grass was carefully planted and the ground was leveled for easy footing. She looked at her paws, concentrating to make each step carefully, and tried to match pace as best as she could. She hadn't realized they were already at the side of the castle wall until the setting sun began shining in her eyes. She looked out into the distance, her eyes widening at the sight. It was an amazing view. With the Capitol being built upon one of the highest summits of the vast mountains of Media, Radio could see the phenomenal structures in the distance. Even Clouder City, her auntie's mark on all of social media. Radio saw the small villages surrounding the mountain, the abandoned city, the vast valleys that stretched across most of the central region, and the sanctified meadows that the folk of Media always managed to keep the council from destroying. They were the same meadows her aunt had another name for, too. Radio gasped as she saw the structures even beyond central Media, which looked even more impressive than what she could see up close. Radio admired the view of it all, and then turned her eyes back to the valleys below. She hadn't understood why the council wanted to destroy the meadows until now. The meadow was a beautiful, luscious variation of flowers, all of them in hues of violet, purple, and magenta. Those were the colors associated with the former queen of the land that the council was responsible for removing from the throne, and likely a local reminder of her for both the council and the mages. Radio swallowed nervously as she followed Tape and Recorder once more. The two moved along the unsteady ground even better than Video, which surprised Radio. She had expected the courier to not miss a beat with all of the traveling done across the land. But Tape and Recorder moved so effortlessly, it made Radio wonder how much they may have explored the outskirts of the capital as kittens, assuming they grew up here. She smiled as they hopped on a ledge in sync and hurried forward. Radio took the strongest leap she could. She felt the breeze brush through her fur as she came into contact with the ledge, scrambling up to the surface with them. She let out a breath of exhaustion, not used to the hike or the adventure like these four. Even Pictures, the slender, supposedly pampered Tom from Clouder City, had an easy time hopping up onto the ledge with Recorder and Tape.
Here it is,
Recorder said, walking up to a glowing crystal fragment. Radio's eyes widened at the sight of the object. It was nearly the size of her forearm. It gleamed even redder than it did in the recordings with the setting sun's beams shining against it. Radio frowned slightly. This really wasn't a game. Here she was, with 2 other cats she had never met before this day, about to venture out to explore all of Media in search of these strange magical artifacts. Artifacts were what her family, the nobles of Media, were responsible for trying to remove from this land in the first place. It made Radio wonder all the more about their fate on this journey. What would this jester do upon seeing them? Was this all a part of an elaborate trap against the nobles and royalty? If that was so, why were the courier and monitors involved? A grudge against the messengers who brought the rigged offer to the queen and the bystanders who stood back and not only gave witness to what played out long ago? The idea began to slightly sink in, and she only blinked back into focus when Pictures walked past her, looking curiously at Video, who fearlessly sank her teeth into the fragment and pulled it out from the ground.
Our guards attempted to take the shard from the ground earlier today, and were struck back with severe burns against any area that came in contact with the object,
Recorder explained, looking up at Video with concern.
I guess this means these are the right ones, though. The ones chosen by the jester.
Tape stammered, shocked to see the giant tabby holding the item without hesitation, and then looked at Radio and Pictures with just as round eyes. Pictures nodded, coming forward. He took the shard from Video's jaws by gripping the tip of it in his teeth and pulling it from her. He lifted his white paw and rested the artifact on the pads of it, while still keeping the toy clamped firmly in his jaws. Radio's eyes rounded even more at the idea of the object doing such terrifying damage. And yet, these 2 cats stood exchanging it with each other without showing the smallest bit of fear. She backed up when Pictures slowly blinked at her, managing to turn his head and still hold the object between his teeth. All of her apprehension flooded up to her head when he nodded to her and let the shard go from the grip of his fangs, expecting her to take the item from his paw. She looked over at Recorder and Tape, who both smiled at her, and lifted out her paw. Her pads trembled in fear as Pictures dropped the shard onto her outstretched paw, worried what the consequence might be if Frequency was really the one who should have been chosen. She quickly lifted up her arm to take the item once it landed against her paw pad, and tightened her claws against the hard crystal surface. She was surprised at how warm the shard was when she gained a steady hold. The light and power reflected directly against her body and eyes as she stared into it, and she had to blink away the light as it blinded her more effectively than the sun's rays had. She opened her eyes again once she turned her head away, and looked up at Pictures once she felt his gaze on her. He stared at her with approval and excitement, making her cheeks warmer than the shard's heat. She felt butterflies in her stomach seeing him look at her like that, and without thinking, she automatically gave the shard to Tape when the bulky cat approached her. He reflexively took it from her, then screeched and jumped back, hissing as the item burned his paw pad.
Oh, I am so sorry!
Radio leapt over, picking up the dropped shard between her teeth as Tape ran his tongue against his burnt pad, making both Recorder and Pictures sigh in relief after realizing it hadn't done anything severe to the stocky Tom. Video glared down at Tape for having accepted it, the Tom having been the most nervous about it in the first place, then turned her piercing stare to Radio. The intensity made Radio shrink down with her ears flattened. She immediately let Video take the shard from her jaws and watched as she put it in the bag Tape and Recorder had previously attached to her. Recorder gave one assuring pat to Tape, then strode past Pictures and nodded to both Radio and Video. Recorder smiled then and enthused.
Congratulations, you 3. You were obviously the ones chosen for this, and we wish you luck on your journey.
Recorder and Radio both turned their heads to look out into the valleys below the capital, and admired the sight, being even more beautiful from the ledge than compared to looking out from the city gates.
The path may be rough. We don't know what this mage plans, but we know for sure that we'll be here anytime you need help.
Recorder looked to Radio now.
We believe you can do this.
We hope you'll be careful.
Tape limped away from Pictures to stand beside Recorder.
So far, we haven't seen the one who caused all of this since the incident last night, but we'll let you know if that changes. Currently, the best route to take is to the south. Safe journeys, you three. We're all rooting for you.
Thank you, Tape. Pictures gave a smile to the shorter Tom as he stepped over to Video's side. Radio touched her nose to Recorder's cheek, and both dipped their necks to touch their foreheads together in an embrace.
We really appreciate all your help.
Radio murmured, and stepped back to be led away by Video.
Of course, Miss Radio.
Recorder smiled as she and Tape trailed behind the three.
Bye-bye! Good luck!
The two called out from the ledge as Video bounded down with Radio, and Pictures following. Radio smiled at the siblings' positivity, but thoughts began to spin in her head about the whole scenario. This wasn't the chosen ones going back to the castle. This was the three of them starting on their way to find the other shards. She walked in silence with her companions for a while, but the thoughts flooded her mind. What were the odds that this whole situation worked out like it did? Radio swallowed, then turned to Pictures, who began to look at her with concern. She blinked at him, staring into his round, multicolored eyes, and let the words spill out.
My sister decided that I should go instead of her. It worked out that I had been the youngest noble to be born, so I could hold the shards, but it seems weird that it turned out fine. With such short notice, the idea of it sounds even more unlikely, like it was almost as though she knew about it or something, which is what really makes me feel weird.
Radio looked away from Pictures, her last words drifting into a mumble as she started to worry about sharing her concern with the surveillance officer. How could one ever doubt the frequency star? Her eyes flattened, waiting for Pictures' censure at her words. Pictures seemed unfazed, though. Some things are just meant to be. Calamities like this always happen with strange luck and chance. I know I'm grateful that you're here, Miss Radio. He smiled at her and then looked ahead. This venture may be beyond anything we've ever witnessed. It could also be the greatest journey of our lives. The optimism and positivity of his words made Radio chuckle. Shaking her head and looking up at the setting sun, his words made her think about the opportunity given to her because of this. She couldn't find fault with his outlook.
Yes, that I have to agree with you on. Pictures.
Radio sighed.